The day I transferred my entire life savings to my sister, she booked a luxury vacation the very next week. My parents said nothing. My name was never mentioned. And I smiled at Sunday dinner like everything was fine. But I was done being fine. This is the story of what I did next, and the one night that flipped their entire world upside down. Caroline Merritt had always believed that if you worked hard enough, loved quietly enough, and asked for nothing eventually, the people who mattered would notice. She was 31 years old, a structural engineer based in Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work, but honest, the kind that required precision, patience, and a willingness to carry invisible weight. She drove a 7-year-old Civic, packed her own lunches, and sent $300 home to her parents every single month. Had been doing it since she was 24. 7 years. Never missed once. Never mentioned it at dinner. Never expected applause. That was Caroline. Steady, quiet, invisible in the way that useful people often become invisible. Her younger sister, Vanessa, was the opposite, loud in all the right ways, magnetic, the kind of beautiful that made strangers lean in at parties. Their mother, Diane, had decided somewhere in Vanessa's infancy that one daughter would be adored and one would be depended upon. Caroline, with her serious eyes and her straight A's and her desperate hunger for approval, had been handed the second role before she was old enough to protest. She didn't see it for years. That was the cruelest part. For 7 years, Caroline had been saving with one specific dream in mind, a small house on the east side of Columbus. She had a folder on her laptop titled Home. Paint colors, mortgage calculators, yard dimensions. She had $41,000 saved, every dollar earned through 12-hour workdays, and skipped vacations, and lunches eaten alone at her desk while her coworkers talked about weekend trips she couldn't afford. Then her father called on a Sunday evening. Gerald Merritt's voice had the careful, over-rehearsed quality of a man delivering bad news he'd been coached on. Vanessa and her husband Derek were going to lose their house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Dublin, if someone didn't step in. $38,000 to cover the mortgage arrears. The bank was already moving. "I know it's a lot," Gerald said. "Dad." Caroline's voice was steady. "That's everything I've saved." "You're young. You can save again." A pause, weighted with something that wasn't quite shame. "Vanessa has children. A family. She needs this more right now. You can always save again." She wrote those words in her journal that night in red ink and stared at them until they blurred. She told herself she needed a few days to think, but 2 evenings later, her mother called, and Diane Merritt did not ask. Diane reminded Caroline, softly and surgically, of every sacrifice ever made on her behalf. The college tuition help, the interview code, 7 years of a roof that had been provided without complaint. "Family takes care of family," Diane said. "That's who we are." Caroline transferred $38,500 the following morning. Then she sat at her kitchen table in the silence of her apartment and felt something settle into her chest, cold and dense and permanent, that she had no name for yet. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was the specific, cellular sensation of finally understanding what she was to these people. 3 weeks later, Caroline drove to her parents' house for Sunday dinner, telling herself she just needed one thing: acknowledgement. Not a speech, not a gift. Just one moment where someone looked at her and said, "We know what you gave us," and it meant something. She walked into a kitchen full of champagne flutes and laughter. Vanessa was glowing in a new cream blouse, describing a bathroom renovation she and Derek were planning for the Dublin house. Derek stood by the counter, relaxed as a man on permanent vacation. Gerald was laughing at something. Diane was pulling a roast from the oven, humming softly. 3 hours at that table, not a single thank you, not one word. When Caroline finally said, quietly, "I'm glad things worked out," Vanessa smiled brightly and said, "Everything happens for a reason, right?" That night, Caroline sat in her parked car outside her apartment for 40 minutes. She didn't go inside. She just sat there in the dark, engine off, hands in her lap, staring at the dashboard crack she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. What came next was worse. A month later, scrolling Instagram at midnight, she found Vanessa's new photo album, 5 days in Cancun, swim-up bar, beachfront resort, Vanessa in a yellow bikini, Derek in linen, both of them luminous with the particular joy of people who have never once questioned whether they deserve good things. The trip had been booked in March, 1 week after the transfer. Caroline set her phone face down on the mattress and lay very still. She did the math slowly, the way she calculated structural loads at work, carefully, without rushing, and arrived at a conclusion she couldn't unknow. Either the financial crisis had been dramatically exaggerated, or the money had been distributed in ways her father had never mentioned. She called her mother. "Where exactly did that money go?" she asked. A pause, long enough to confess everything without saying a word. It covered what needed covering. "Did my money pay for that Cancun trip, Mom?" Diane's voice shifted into its softest, most dangerous register. "You gave that money out of love, Caroline. Don't ruin it by making it ugly." Then, "Your sister needed a break. She's been under tremendous stress." Caroline hung up. She sat on her bathroom floor, cold tile, spine against the tub, and finally understood something she should have understood 20 years ago. She hadn't been raised. She had been farmed. Every accomplishment extracted, every sacrifice harvested, every expression of love quietly converted into someone else's resource. She called in sick the next morning, and the morning after. For 11 days, she barely left the apartment. Crackers, soup, the ceiling fan turning overhead. Friends texted. She didn't reply. She had no words for what she felt, because there was no single word for the devastation of realizing that your family's love was always transactional, and the transaction had always favored someone else. She lost weight. She stopped answering her door. On the 12th day, she opened her journal and wrote one sentence at 4 in the morning. She didn't plan to. Her hand just moved. "If they will not see me, I will make them reckon with what they lost." She read it back. She didn't cross it out. What followed wasn't dramatic. No fire in the eyes, no movie moment declaration, just a quiet, methodical decision to stop being useful to people who mistook her usefulness for weakness. She went back to work. She started running not for appearance, but because she needed somewhere to put the anger. She started therapy with a calm, direct woman named Dr. Anita Flores, and in their 3rd session, she said, "I don't want revenge the way a bitter person wants it. I want something more precise. I want them to understand the weight of what they threw away." Dr. Flores studied her for a moment. "There's a difference between justice and punishment." "I know," Caroline said. "I'm still working out which one I need." She thought about stopping many times. On quiet evenings, when the moral weight of what she was considering pressed down on her, she'd sit with her journal and ask herself whether she was becoming someone she wouldn't recognize. She called Dr. Flores. She walked miles in the dark. She prayed once, which surprised her, but she kept thinking about Raymond. Raymond Merritt was her father's older brother, 73, a retired federal judge, no children, a stone house in Bexley, and a quietly held belief that character was the only inheritance worth leaving. Over the years, he had made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that his estate worth roughly $2.3 million would go to whichever of Gerald's children had demonstrated the most integrity. Everyone in the family understood this. No one said it aloud. Vanessa had spent years performing for Raymond holiday cards, birthday calls, choreographed visits with her children, arranged like a magazine spread. Caroline had simply been herself around him, quiet, capable, honest. He seemed to prefer that. But preference wasn't a will. Caroline began documenting bank transfer records, screenshots of Vanessa's Cancún photos with timestamps, a 7-year ledger of every dollar she'd sent home. She built it the way she built structural reports, fact by fact, without emotion, organized for someone who would read it with a judge's eye. She also thought carefully about what she was not willing to do. She would not lie. She would not manipulate. She would not become the thing she was fighting. What she wanted was simple and devastating. She wanted the truth to be seen by someone with the power to make it matter. That was all. That, she told herself, was enough. In late September, Caroline requested a meeting with Raymond. She drove to Bexley on a Thursday afternoon, brought coffee from the cafe he'd mentioned once 2 years ago and never forgotten, and sat across from him in the study where he kept his law books and a framed photograph of his late wife. "I'm not here for money," she said before he could speak. "I want you to know that first." She handed him the folder. "You've always said character is the only currency that matters. I think you should know what character actually looks like in this family when no one is performing for an audience." Raymond read slowly. He was a former judge. He read the way judges do with his whole body, completely still, giving nothing away. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it on his knee. He asked 3 questions. They were precise, the questions of someone who had spent decades separating testimony from truth. Then he was quiet for a long time. "Why now?" he said. Caroline looked at him evenly. "Because I'm done waiting to be seen by people who decided long ago not to look." She drove home and went silent. No calls to her parents. No contact with Vanessa. She went to work. She had dinner with friends she'd been neglecting. She felt, strangely, lighter. Not happy, not yet, but unburdened. The way a structure feels after unnecessary weight is removed. 6 weeks later, she learned, through a cousin who didn't realize what she was sharing, that Raymond had changed his estate attorney, that he had met with Gerald for dinner and the evening had ended badly, that Vanessa had called their mother screaming and no one would say about what. Then a plain white envelope arrived in her mailbox. Inside, a cashier's check from Raymond Merritt, $38,500. A handwritten note clipped behind it. "This was never yours to lose." Someone should say so. Caroline held the check at her kitchen table for a long time. She thought about what it meant and what it couldn't undo. Then she set it down carefully, opened her laptop, and emailed the real estate agent she hadn't spoken to in 8 months. She had a house to buy. The call came on a Friday evening in November. Diane's voice, usually so carefully composed, was stripped raw, trembling at the edges, in a way Caroline had almost never heard. Raymond had updated his estate. Vanessa and Gerald had been informed. The conversation had apparently been brief and final. "What did you tell him?" Diane asked. "The truth. You went behind this family's back. I went to the only person in this family who has ever cared what kind of people we actually are." Silence. Then Diane said something that Caroline had not prepared for. "Your father cried," Diane whispered. "When Raymond called, he sat at the kitchen table and cried for an hour. I haven't seen him cry like that since his mother died. Diane, I seen him cried." Before Caroline could speak, she heard another voice in the background, sharp, familiar, getting louder. Vanessa had been there the whole time. "Give me the phone." A shuffle. Then Vanessa's voice, not soft, not performing, just raw and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You ran to Raymond like a child. You sabotaged this entire family because you couldn't handle being the one who actually contributes." "Vanessa." Caroline's voice was quieter than she expected, steadier. "I gave you $38,500. You went to Cancún." Silence. "I built 7 years of savings. You spent it in a week and said everything happens for a reason." She paused. "So here's the reason. This is it. Right now." "You are so bitter." "I'm not bitter. I'm done." Caroline said it the way she said everything now, without heat, without apology. "I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being the one who sacrifices quietly so you can live loudly. And the next time you want to call someone at 2 in the morning crying about your choices, call someone whose savings account you haven't emptied. She hung up. She stood at her kitchen window for a long time. Columbus sat quiet in the November dark. She had expected triumph. She had imagined it would feel like a door slamming shut. Instead, it felt like standing in a demolished building, the danger gone, but the landscape still unrecognizable. Then Diane's words drifted back. He cried for an hour. And beneath all the anger, Caroline felt something she hadn't expected. A complicated, unwanted grief, not for what she'd lost, for what had never existed, for the father who had known for years he was doing something wrong and had simply lacked the courage to stop, for the mother who had built a family around a favorite and called it love, for the sister who had grown up receiving everything and learned nothing from it, and whether that, too, was its own quiet prison. 2 weeks later, she signed the closing papers on a craftsman house on the east side of Columbus. 3 bedrooms, a front porch, 1 old maple in the yard that the agent mentioned would go extraordinary colors in autumn. She walked through the empty rooms alone, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood, and stood in the kitchen with her palm flat against the wall. She didn't take photographs. She didn't post anything. She stood in the silence of her own home and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, like she had finally stopped auditioning. Gerald called on a Saturday morning in December. He said he was sorry, haltingly, imperfectly, the way men practice accountability for the very first time late in life. It was insufficient. It was also not nothing. "I'll think about it," she told him, and she meant it, because here was what revenge had quietly taught her, not the getting of it, but the surviving of it. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel the way anger promised. It feels quieter, more complicated, and the question it leaves behind isn't did they suffer enough, but who do you want to be now that you no longer have to fight? The most dangerous thing a woman can do is stop being silent about the price of her love, because once she speaks the truth out loud, the people who fed on her silence discover they were never as powerful as they believed. And she discovers she always was.